Hello everyone, tonight we're talking about a world where the night sky wasn't decoration, it was the only GPS that never failed, never ran out of signal, and never tried to reroute you through a swamp. From timing the planting of corn with a faint cluster of stars, so small you'd mistake it for dust, to watching the Milky Way not as a galaxy but as a spirit highway for the dead, to steering canoes across fog-drenched rivers guided only by constellations, you'll see how orientation was less about compasses and more about cosmic choreography. If this kind of strange history speaks to you, take a second to like the video or subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy wandering into the obscure with me. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments so I can imagine this constellation of listeners spread across the globe. Now, lower the lights, maybe pour yourself some tea, or let the soft hum of a fan keep you company. Let's lean back, breathe, and step into the night sky as it once was, a living map, stretched above us. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Forget GPS. Forget paper maps with cute little north arrows and gas stations circled in red ink. If you had been born a few centuries earlier on the North American plains or along its rivers, your navigation system was written directly above your head. The night sky was your compass, your calendar, your silent traveling companion. And unlike your phone, it never ran out of battery unless, of course, you were unlucky enough to hit a week of thick cloud cover. Then you were forced to improvise with trees, rivers, or the occasional very opinionated elder who swore Orion was a little to the left this season. Here's the thing, maps, the way Europeans carried them around, just weren't the native language of the Americas. Why drag around parchment when the stars could give you more precision than anything sketched in ink? If you'd grown up in those traditions, you'd have learned to look up before you ever thought of looking down. The sky wasn't abstract. It was a library, and everyone knew which shelf Venus sat on, which corner of the Milky Way to follow if you wanted to find your way back from a hunting trip, and which star cluster meant don't plant corn yet unless you want the harvest to taste like disappointment. And don't imagine this. Knowledge was niche or optional. If you were traveling across the Great Plains, for example, the land stretched out in a way that laughed at landmarks. No helpful mountains to point at. Just grass, horizon, and the faint hope that you hadn't walked in a circle all day. Without the sky, you'd be as lost as a tourist trying to navigate New York with a medieval treasure map. But with the sky, orientation was immediate. Stars rose and set at predictable points on the horizon. Once you learned the cycles, you could cross enormous distances with confidence. And unlike those fragile maps Europeans loved to soak accidentally in rain, the constellations didn't disintegrate. Of course, the stars weren't just practical. You weren't just following dots of light, like some ancient pilot charting a flight path. Each one was tied to a story, and stories had teeth. The Pawnee, for instance, didn't just notice the morning star, they integrated it into their entire cosmology, rituals, and seasonal migrations. You weren't looking at astronomy divorced from life. You were literally watching your ancestors retell the world's creation every night. Your compass wasn't just directional, it was spiritual GPS with mythological customer support. And here's where the irony sets in. Europeans often arrived calling native nations primitive because they didn't use parchment maps. But picture it, you're the primitive one, and yet you can cross prairies at night with only a sky full of fire as your guide, while your so-called advanced visitor gets lost half a mile from camp and insists on asking the moss on a tree for advice. Who exactly looks primitive here? So if you'd been born into this world, your sense of direction wouldn't come from a piece of paper folded in a pocket. It would come from tilting your head back, tracing the slow arc of constellations, and recognizing that north, south, east, and west weren't abstract compass points but living relationships between earth and sky. And just when you thought you'd mastered the art of looking up, you'd realize that those same stars weren't just guiding your feet, they were dictating your crops, your ceremonies, and the rhythm of your entire society. But before we get into that, let's step into the cosmos, the way they did, where orientation wasn't just geography, but cosmology. So you've tilted your head back, found your bearings in the dark, and maybe even bragged a little that you could walk straight through an endless prairie without tripping over your own ego. But here's the catch. The stars weren't just dots to point the way. If you'd been raised in those communities, you'd have known that every point of light was stitched into a story, and every story carried obligations. You weren't just looking at navigation aids. You were staring at your own mythology, keeping watch. Take the cardinal directions. Europeans liked to sketch them as neat little lines crossing on a compass rose, the sort of thing you'd embroider onto a sailor's pillow. For many native nations, those directions were alive. North, south, east, west each had colors, spirits, histories. The Lakota saw the sky as a great dome where the four quarters held the universe in balance. Orientation wasn't about turn left at the boulder and walk east. It was about aligning yourself with the very forces that stitched the world together. If you messed that up, you weren't just lost geographically, you were out of step with creation itself. And this is where your sense of irony should tingle. Because if you'd lived under those teachings, you'd never dare call directions abstract. Imagine explaining to an elder that you thought east was just where the sun rises. They'd look at you the way you'd look at someone who says gravity is just a suggestion. East wasn't casual, it was the place of beginnings, of the morning star, of renewal. If you planted facing the wrong way, you might as well have written a letter to the cosmos saying, I don't care if the corn dies, I've got snacks from somewhere else. Now, the stars themselves were more than pinpricks of light. They were ancestors, guides, sometimes even direct actors in the unfolding of events. The Pawnee arranged their villages in alignment with celestial patterns, as if laying down homes was also laying down cosmic blueprints. The Zuni used the position of the sun and stars, not just to decide when to farm, but how to center their ceremonies. You weren't separating the practical from the sacred. You were braiding them so tightly together that you couldn't even pull them apart without unraveling the whole thing. Think about that. You, wandering around in your sneakers, maybe fumbling with Google Maps, while someone 1,000 years earlier could stand under the stars and not only know where to walk, but also why walking mattered. You'd call it superstition, maybe. They'd call it living in balance with the sky. And honestly, who comes out looking smarter in that comparison? Because once you believed the heavens were holding up the world with their stories, you couldn't shrug off a crooked step. Every journey was a kind of ritual, every orientation a recommitment to cosmic order. And if you thought that sounds exhausting, don't worry, there was comfort in it too. You weren't just alone in the dark. You had the Milky Way stretching above you like a luminous path, and ancestors watching to make sure you didn't wander into stupidity. Which, considering human history, was probably a full-time job. And just when you were starting to feel cozy under that vast dome of meaning, someone would remind you that traveling at night wasn't just about symbolism. It was about survival. Because if you wanted to move far without burning alive under the midday sun, or scaring every animal within 10 miles, you learned to walk when the sky was your only map. Now, let's be honest here, not out there gazing at constellations for poetry's sake. You're walking, hauling, sometimes sprinting across distances that make your knees ache just thinking about them. And if you'd been born into one of those communities, you wouldn't be doing that under the noon sun. You'd wait for the night. Because the night wasn't just cooler, it was smarter. Imagine trudging across the Great Plains with no shade in sight. By midday, the grass itself seems to hiss at you. The horizon waves with heat, and your tongue feels like it's been stuffed with sand. A European explorer might have chosen that exact moment to unfold his map, promptly lose it to the wind, and curse both cartography and the sun. But if you were raised with ancestral instruction, you knew better. You moved under stars, with the cool air easing your lungs and the sky giving you direction. Traveling at night wasn't laziness, it was survival strategy polished over centuries. And those stars weren't just vague northish suggestions. They rose and set at the same points on the horizon year after year, more reliable than any trail marker. The Pawnee, for instance, used the morning star Venus as a beacon for movement and ceremony. Coastal peoples up north watched the Big Dipper wheel around Polaris, using it like a celestial anchor. You didn't need parchment when the entire universe was playing connect the dots above your head. Of course, walking by starlight came with its quirks. Your feet had to learn terrain by feel. Rivers shimmered in the dark, and their sound became part of your orientation system. Even the rustling of grass or the way owls called in certain directions could help guide you. Imagine combining astronomy with ecology, meteorology, and plain common sense. You weren't just following stars, you were reading a whole orchestra of signals. And if you missed a note, well, good luck explaining to your traveling companions why you spent 3 hours circling back to the same dead cottonwood tree. Here's the irony. The sky may have been stable, but you weren't. Clouds rolled in, storms broke, or mountains blocked the horizon. And that's when ancestral knowledge kicked in. You'd been trained not to panic. If Orion disappeared behind thunderheads, you didn't throw up your hands and say, well, that's it, we live here now. You shifted to secondary cues, the angle of rivers, the prevailing winds, the bend of tree trunks shaped by years of weather. The sky was always plan A, but the earth itself could be plan B. And let's not pretend this was a primitive fallback. Modern survivalists still train in celestial navigation because it works better than any gadget when you're off the grid. So if you're imagining yourself strolling at night with nothing but stars overhead, remember that you're not romanticizing your retracing techniques that kept entire nations alive. But walking under the stars wasn't only about endurance or direction. It shaped how people thought about space itself. On the open plains, where the horizon never ended, the night sky was the only ceiling you had. And under that ceiling, you weren't just a body moving through grass, you were a small point echoing the very constellations you followed. Which is how a simple walk at night turned into a kind of philosophy lesson. And if you thought nighttime travel was clever, wait until you step onto a coast, or a river broad enough that the horizon itself becomes tricky. Because on water, the stars stopped being optional, they were the only way home. The Great Plains stretch out like an ocean of grass, and if you were set down in the middle of them without preparation, the landscape would laugh at you. No mountains to orient against, no forests to mark distance, just horizon, folding into horizon. In a place like that, the sky wasn't a decoration, it was the only reliable architecture. Among nations such as the Lakota and Pawnee, constellations weren't simply noticed. They were woven into movement, ceremony, and even the way villages were laid out. Stars became a skeleton for geography. Orion's belt pointed out east-west lines across the emptiness. The North Star gave a pivot around which everything else turned. Venus rose like a clock hand, reminding you not only which direction the morning faced, but also when to start rituals or hunts. The prairie had no street signs, but the heavens had plenty. Think of the absurdity of relying on a hand-drawn European map here. Ink lines meant nothing in grasslands that shifted with fire, bison, herds, or wind. A storm could erase any sense of trail, but it couldn't erase the arc of the constellations. The land was a blank page. The sky was the script written over it, and it wasn't just practical orientation blended with myth. The Pawnee, for example, held ceremonies around the morning star and evening star, interpreting their positions not only for planting and war, but also as signs of cosmic order. The celestial dome doubled as a textbook and a cathedral. Each point of light carried meaning that guided steps on the earth. Of course, all this precision was learned, not guessed. Children grew up hearing stories that doubled as navigational codes. An elder might tell how a trickster tried to shift the stars but failed, embedding in memory the fact that the stars rise from the same places every year, never tricking anyone at all. Myths worked as mnemonic devices, ensuring that orientation could be passed down without charts or compasses. Consider the irony. European explorers, armed with compasses, maps, and arrogance, sometimes found themselves wandering hopelessly across the plains. Meanwhile, local communities labeled primitive by those same men used constellations like a flawless global positioning system. Which method looks more sophisticated? The one that disintegrates in rain, or the one tattooed across the heavens every single night? Walking the plains by starlight was more than navigation, it was alignment with balance itself. Every direction carried weight, every turn corresponded to a cosmic rhythm. The emptiness wasn't terrifying because the sky above was always speaking, always giving instructions. And if grasslands made the stars indispensable, water demanded even more. Out on rivers and coastlines, where waves erased footprints and horizons played tricks, the only certainty was the sky's slow choreography. Water is a trickster. On land, at least, you can count blades of grass, notice the bend of a tree, or feel the slope under your feet. On rivers and coasts, everything shifts currents, drag, fog erases distance, and the horizon repeats itself like a cruel joke. In that kind of world, the stars weren't just helpful, They were the only thing standing between direction and disaster. Along the Pacific Northwest, the night sky served as a ledger of routes that crossed bays and islands. Canoes moved in rhythm with constellations, navigating in ways that later explorers couldn't comprehend. To an outsider, the voyage looked like luck. To those raised in the tradition, it was geometry written in starlight. A certain star's rise marked a bend in the coast. The setting of another told when to angle inland to reach a river mouth. Accuracy came not from ink on paper but from generations of watching and remembering. Farther north, Inuit navigators combined celestial cues with ice, wind, and the behavior of animals. Polaris hung steady above the horizon, refusing to join the rest in their nightly rotations. That stubborn star became an anchor for orientation in a world where snow erased every landmark by morning. Even on the open Arctic Sea, hunters could measure their angle against the pole star and know precisely where to go. The technique was so consistent that European whalers, once dismissive, eventually had to admit that Inuit pilots outperformed their compasses, and the rivers wide, shifting, unpredictable, were also mapped by the sky. The Mississippi, for instance, wasn't just followed by the waterline. Travelers marked where certain stars rose or set in relation to the river's curves. When fog swallowed the banks, the heavens restored order. If you could keep track of where the Big Dipper was tipping, or how Orion crossed above, you could keep moving without straying into the labyrinth of tributaries. This blending of water and sky meant that navigation was never purely technical. It was ecological and spiritual at once. Water mirrored the heavens, and so journeys became double-layered, paddling across a river below, while following another one above, the Milky Way itself. Oral traditions turned these correspondences into stories. The spirit rode in the sky, guiding the real roads on Earth. The contrast with European methods becomes almost comic here. Imagine dragging a waterlogged map through mist, trying to guess which bend of the coastline you'd drawn last month still looked the same today. Meanwhile, local navigators were lifting their eyes and reading a map that could never get soggy, never rip, never lie. Following rivers by starlight wasn't simply a trick for survival, it created a whole philosophy of travel. Movement wasn't just going from point A to point B. It was aligning body, boat, and story with the cosmos. Every journey became proof that the world above and the world below were stitched together. And just when the coastlines and rivers felt mapped into your bones, another need rose: the soil itself. Because orientation wasn't only about moving across space. It was also about timing life around cycles of planting and harvest, all of which were written in the same sky. Stars weren't just arrows pointing across land and water. They were clock-silent, merciless clocks that told when to dig, when to plant, and when to stop pretending last year's corn stash was going to last. If you'd lived in Pueblo or Hopi country, for instance, you wouldn't be checking the soil with your finger like a suburban gardener. You'd be looking up, waiting for the heliacal rising of certain constellations, because the heavens dictated the first seed. The Pleiades, that faint cluster of stars you probably only notice on a clear winter night, meant serious business. Their disappearance into the glare of the sun told some communities that it was time to prepare for harvest. Their return just before dawn marked new cycles of planting. Imagine that, a handful of stars so dim they almost looked like dust flecks in the sky, controlling when entire villages broke out their digging sticks, missed the signal, and you weren't just latio, risked hunger, ritual imbalance, and endless complaints from elders reminding you they told you so back in spring. Agriculture and navigation folded into one another because both demanded timing. The same star that guided your steps across plains at night also whispered when to align your crops with rainfall and soil. For the Zuni, the position of the sun and stars guided both ceremonies and irrigation cycles. They didn't separate farming from orientation, because why would you? The world above was the calendar. The world below was the notebook where it was written down, season after season, row after row of maize. It wasn't just about growing food, it was about harmony. Crops weren't planted randomly, but at moments when the cosmos itself signaled balance, and this balance wasn't negotiable. Plant too early, and frost bit the seedlings. Plant too late, and the rains betrayed you. The sky didn't accept excuses. It didn't care that your cousin overslept, or that you were feeling lazy. The Pleiades rose when they rose. Orion tilted when it tilted. And if you ignored them, well, enjoy your diet of spiritual regret and maybe a handful of shriveled beans. European colonists sometimes mocked this reliance on superstition, then promptly planted wheat in the wrong season and wondered why the fields sulked. Indigenous farmers, meanwhile, had centuries of calibration baked into their sky watching. They weren't gambling. They were running the most precise agricultural almanac on Earth. No paper, no print, just memorized stories tied to constellations, passed down like sacred family recipes, except these recipes decided whether your children lived through winter. Think about how that changes your relationship with the heavens. The sky isn't distant anymore. It isn't some abstract dome painted over your head. It's a partner, strict but reliable. The same constellations that guided migration also guaranteed survival through agriculture. Orientation was never just travel, it was food, community, continuity. And once you've accepted that tiny points of light control your dinner, it's not a huge leap to see them as personalities, ancestors, or entire clans set above. Which is exactly how clusters like the Pleiades became more than agricultural signals. They became family in the sky. That faint smudge of stars most modern people mistake for a speck of dust on their glasses carried far more weight across native nations. The Pleiades weren't just pretty, they were clocks, calendars, and sometimes kin. If you'd been raised in those traditions, you wouldn't have rolled your eyes at them like a half-hearted astronomy student. You'd have looked at them with the kind of seriousness usually reserved today for bank account balances and weather apps. Among the Cherokee, the clusters rising in autumn signaled the season for hunting and for certain ceremonies. For the Navajo, the Pleiades called Dilie were tied to the timing of planting, teaching that their appearance in the east before dawn meant the corn should already be in the ground. Pueblo peoples also tied their ceremonial cycle to this delicate group of stars, weaving their positions into rituals that aligned the village with the cosmos. Imagine the pressure, 6 faint stars deciding both your dinner and your destiny. And it wasn't only in one region. Across the continent, different nations kept an eye on the same cluster, interpreting it in their own languages and stories, but always with gravity. You could travel hundreds of miles and still find the Pleiades being treated as a kind of cosmic metronome. That's not coincidence. That's consistency across centuries of watching and listening to the heavens. It's easy to laugh at modern constellations, Orion as a hunter, Cassiopeia as a queen. But laugh too hard, and you'll miss the irony. The so-called mythological nonsense of indigenous sky stories functioned as seasonal instructions so precise that entire communities survived by them. Compare that to Europeans dragging almanacs across oceans, pages smudged, dates often wrong, while insisting their ink was superior to your starlight. The arrogance is almost funny. Almost. Stories about the Pleiades weren't just mnemonics, they carried emotion. In some traditions, the stars represented lost children, or sisters fleeing from danger, or ancestral figures placed in the heavens as eternal reminders. When you looked up, you weren't only checking the date, you were remembering loss. Community, morality, navigation, and calendar keeping became inseparable from human feeling. And isn't that more binding than a paper chart you can misplace in a storm? The Pleiades taught that the sky didn't just tell you where to go, it reminded you why you were going at all. Travel, agriculture, and ceremony converged in that soft patch of light, proof that orientation was never mechanical. It was spiritual accountability, written above your head so you couldn't pretend to forget it. And once you'd learned to read the Pleiades with such care, it was only natural to see the rest of the heavens in similar terms. Orion wasn't just a hunter made up by Greeks, its belt pointed across the plains like a cosmic arrow. The Milky Way wasn't just a spill of light, it was a road, a river, a reminder that your path on Earth had its twin in the sky. Once the Pleiades had you checking the season, Orion and the Milky Way took over the job of showing you the way. Orion's belt, those 3 bright stars lined up like buttons on the night's jacket, wasn't just a constellation borrowed from Greek myths. Across native traditions, it acted as a landmark in the heavens, a directional tool you could trust, even when the land itself refused to cooperate. Draw a line through that belt, and you could orient yourself east to west with a confidence that no compass needle in damp weather could beat. And then there was the Milky Way, that broad pale streak stretching across the sky. To European stargazers, it was an astronomical curiosity. To many native nations, it was a road sometimes called the Spirit Road or Ghost Trail. It wasn't metaphorical fluff. It was treated as a real path that spirits followed after death, a celestial echo of the roads and rivers below. When you traveled at night, you could literally follow the same route ancestors were believed to walk in the afterlife. Orientation became doubled earthly direction beneath your feet, spiritual direction above your head. Among the Pawnee, the Milky Way was tied to migration and ceremony. For the Navajo, it was Yakizdaha, the slanted path of the spirits. In northern regions, it aligned hunters moving under dark skies. A sweep of light across the heavens became the ultimate landmark, visible even when all else failed. You didn't need steel instruments or a sextant, just a memory full of stories and a willingness to look up. Think about the difference in worldview here. Europeans carried navigation charts covered in ink and coordinates, numbers stripped of life. Indigenous travelers carried songs and stories, where the belt of Orion wasn't just a line, it was a guide that connected body, land, and cosmos. Navigation wasn't reduced to mechanics. It was embedded in a web of meaning that made every journey both practical and sacred. Of course, this didn't mean stargazing was leisurely. The margin of error on the plains or at sea was slim. If you misunderstood the arc of Orion or misread the Milky Way's angle, the punishment wasn't embarrassment, it was hunger, thirst, or worse. Which is exactly why those stories weren't optional bedtime tales. They were instruction manuals disguised as mythology, binding memory with survival. And in that irony lies the punchline. Modern people talk about losing touch with the stars, as if it's some poetic loss of romance. For native nations, losing touch with them would have meant losing the very ability to live. You didn't gaze up for inspiration. You gazed up because your life depended on it. Once the belt, the road, and the faint cluster of the Pleiades had trained your eyes, you started to see that the heavens alone weren't enough. Travel meant constant checking against what lay below. Rivers, mountains, sacred markers. The land and sky were meant to be read together, like two halves of the same book. Sky knowledge never floated alone. It was always braided with the earth itself. The stars might tell you north, but the land confirmed whether you were actually walking it or just narrating poetry to yourself. Across the continent, people combined constellations with mountains, rivers, and sacred sites, layering direction until it was nearly impossible to get fooled. Among the Navajo, orientation wasn't just about looking up. Therefore, sacred mountains, Blanca Peak, Mount Taylor, San Francisco Peaks, and Hesperus Mountain anchored the landscape to the cardinal directions. Each was tied to a color and a myth, and together they formed a cosmic map. The stars validated what the mountains declared, and the mountains gave earthly proof to what the heavens whispered. If you were traveling, you weren't just asking, "Where's north?" You were aligning your body inside a geography that was spiritual, ecological, and navigational all at once. Plains communities, lacking mountains, leaned harder on rivers. The arc of the Missouri, or the bend of the Platte, was read in tandem with constellations. When fog swallowed the banks, stars reclaimed their authority. When clouds blocked the sky, rivers and animal tracks picked up the slack. The trick was never choosing one system over the other. It was knowing how to fuse them so that one confirmed the other. Sacred sites carried equal weight. Petroglyphs carved into rocks often marked solar alignments, preserving memory of where the sun rose or set at solstices. These carvings weren't idle decoration. They were permanent post-it notes, reminding future generations how to sync the ground with the heavens. Imagine the absurdity of dismissing them as primitive doodles while hauling around European maps that tore, rotted, or got outdated within months. Stone and stars had more longevity than parchment ever could. Landmark integration also meant animals. Migratory birds traced paths that echoed celestial routes. Herds followed seasonal cycles tied to constellations. The stars didn't exist in isolation, they pulsed through every visible rhythm of land and life. A traveler reading sky alone might walk straight, but a traveler reading sky and earth together walked wisely. And here's the irony that still stings. European explorers stumbled through landscapes they described as trackless wilderness, when in reality those landscapes were crisscrossed with invisible highways written in star patterns, river bends, and sacred markers. The roads were there. The explorers just didn't know how to read them. So navigation in this world wasn't one system stacked on top of another. It was a dialogue, earth checking the sky, sky confirming the earth. Travel became less about moving through empty space and more about constantly realigning yourself with the network of signs. miss one, and another corrected you, forget both, and you were the fool who managed to get lost on a continent where the map was carved into everything you could see. And once this web of guidance was memorized, it had to be passed on, because no child was born knowing which mountain carried which direction, or which star rose in which season. Someone had to teach, and teaching required memory tricks sharp enough to last centuries. Knowing the stars was one thing, making sure the next generation didn't forget them was another. Knowledge of navigation wasn't scribbled into books or locked in dusty libraries. It lived in stories, chants, ceremonies, and the sharp eyes of those willing to spend more nights looking up than sleeping. If you'd been born into those traditions, your astronomy class wouldn't have been in a lecture hall. It would have been on the prairie, under a cold sky, with an elder pointing at constellations and saying, "That's where your path begins, don't mess it up." Oral tradition did the heavy lifting. A myth about a trickster coyote scattering stars across the heavens might sound whimsical, but underneath the laughter was a memory code. Each detail, where the coyote stood, how the stars fell, which cluster formed, fixed a constellation's position in your mind. You weren't memorizing a sterile chart. You were embedding a survival tool inside a story you could never forget. Songs carried similar weight. Some Pueblo ceremonies, for instance, involved chants timed to the appearance of particular stars. By singing, people reinforced the connection between sound, ritual, and orientation. Even if you couldn't read a mark on paper, you could hum your way through the night sky like a living almanac. It's the kind of educational method that modern schools would call multimodal learning. Except here, it was a matter of not starving rather than just passing exams. Elders were central to the process. They weren't simply teachers, they were living archives. A child would sit with them on crisp nights, listening as they named the Pleiades or pointed out Orion's belt, weaving practical advice into sacred narrative. If the child nodded off, they weren't scolded, they were gently nudged awake. Falling asleep under the sky was forgivable. Forgetting how to read it was not. And this knowledge wasn't locked to specialists. Everyone needed enough familiarity to survive. Hunters, travelers, farmers, even children had to understand at least the basics. The precision varied, but the expectation was clear. You belonged to a community that read the sky, and you were accountable to keep that literacy alive. Compare that with European literacy. A sailor could read a map, but a farmer might not even know how to sign his name. In native traditions, literacy of the heavens was more democratic. Stars weren't hoarded knowledge, they were communal, visible to anyone willing to lift their chin. The sky didn't discriminate, it demanded participation. And here lies another irony. European colonists often called oral traditions unreliable because they weren't written down. Yet those same traditions kept navigational accuracy intact for centuries without ink, while European maps often rotted, burned, or became obsolete. What looks fragile from a colonial desk looks indestructible under the night sky. Transmission wasn't just technical, it was spiritual discipline. Learning constellations meant learning respect, patience, and humility. You didn't rush through a sky lesson, you lingered, listened, traced, absorbed. That rhythm shaped not just how people traveled, but how they thought about knowledge itself. And if you're tempted to call this quaint or romantic, pause. Without it, you'd wander blind across a continent, confused and sunburnt, clutching at paper that tore in the rain. With it, you'd belong to a line of memory that outlasted empires. But stars weren't the only teachers. Daylight brought its own techniques, shadows on the ground, sunrise angles, and the long patience of watching how Earth itself echoed the heavens. Stars ruled the night, but daylight wasn't useless. The sun, stubborn and obvious, became a tool just as important as the constellations it drowned out. Shadows marked time as reliably as a clock tower bell. Plant a stick in the ground, watch its shadow shrink and grow, and you could orient yourself with surprising precision. It wasn't fancy, but it was free-and, unlike your phone, the sun never forgot to charge. Communities across the continent used sunrise and sunset points as markers. On the plains, families noted where the sun rose along the horizon through the year, identifying seasonal shifts the way we now glance at calendars. Pueblo peoples watched for solstices from carefully chosen observation points, sometimes built into architecture itself. Picture a priest standing in Chaco Canyon, watching the first light strike exactly through a slit of stone on the morning of the solstice, and telling the entire village, it's time. That wasn't mysticism, it was geometry with better storytelling, rivers and winds added to the toolkit. Water flowed with consistent patterns, offering cues when clouds smothered the stars. Prevailing winds hinted at direction during daylight treks, especially in regions where horizons blurred into sameness. Even trees weren't ignored, trunks bent slightly under years of wind pressure. Branches thickened where sunlight lingered longer. Reading a forest became an art not so different from reading the heavens. Animal behavior played its part too. Migratory birds cut across the sky with seasonal consistency, offering another orientation layer. Hunters knew when flocks appeared, where they flew, and how their patterns mirrored cycles already written in the stars. You didn't need a compass when geese were literally pointing the way. The brilliance here wasn't in choosing between tools, but in layering them. At night, stars guided you. At dawn and dusk, sunrises and sunsets filled in. By day, shadows, winds, and rivers kept the map alive. Every signal was cross-checked against another, like a system designed by redundancy engineers, centuries before redundancy engineers existed. Europeans often mocked this as guesswork. The joke writes itself. Men fumbling with compasses they barely understood, losing maps to rain, and then calling indigenous methods inferior, even though those methods had been refined into survival-grade reliability for centuries. Guesswork doesn't feed communities across millennia. Systems do, but tools were never stripped of meaning. A shadow wasn't just a line, it was a sign of the sun's power. A bird migration wasn't simply a biological event, it was a message woven into the fabric of the world. Knowledge stayed alive, not by reducing it to mechanics, but by wrapping it in story, ceremony, and obligation. That's what made it memorable. So when someone planted a stick in the ground to watch a shadow, they weren't playing scientist, they were connecting earth, sky, and community into a single act of orientation. Navigation was never stripped of spirit. Spirit was never detached from practice. And once all these tools were mastered, movement itself shifted into something deeper. Travel wasn't random wandering, it became a ritual, guided not only by technique, but by the belief that ancestors themselves walked alongside in the stars. Every tool the stars, the rivers, the shadows worked, but none of them were seen as just tools. In native traditions, orientation was rarely mechanical. Movement itself was stitched into a spiritual framework, where every step aligned with ancestors, deities, or cosmic order. If you were traveling, you weren't simply going somewhere, you were walking under supervision. And not the annoying bureaucratic kind, but the kind where the sky itself kept you accountable. Among the Lakota, the four directions carried sacred colors and spirits. Facing east for ceremony wasn't optional, it was mandatory alignment with renewal and beginnings. The Zuni treated the cosmos as a web where every journey had to resonate with balance. The Milky Way wasn't just a stripe of light, it was a literal spirit road, guiding both the living in their travels and the dead in their passage to the other world. Imagine walking at night, the stars overhead not only pointing your way, but reminding you that every ancestor before you had taken that same path. Comforting, yes, also a little eerie. And here's the subtle genius. This framework meant navigation wasn't fragile. Europeans could lose a map and panic. Indigenous communities carried orientation in their worldview. Directions were sacred, so forgetting them was not just dangerous but disrespectful. You weren't simply off course. You were out of harmony with the universe. Try telling that to your GPS when it reroutes you for the 5th time in traffic. Spiritual accountability turned travel into ritual. A journey might start with prayers, songs, or offerings, ensuring you didn't wander unblessed at night when stars shimmered. Those lights weren't cold physics, they were ancestors watching, spirits guiding, or deities warning. You were never alone on the trail, which might explain why loneliness in vast landscapes was less crippling than it would be for someone raised with only paper maps. Even the very act of knowing directions carried moral weight. Among the Navajo, the ability to orient oneself was linked to harmony, or husbo. Failing to keep orientation wasn't just clumsy, it was a crack in your relationship with the cosmos. The sky and earth gave you instructions daily. To ignore them was a kind of arrogance. And here's where the humor bites. Modern people treat being spiritual like lighting incense and doing yoga once a week. In these traditions, being spiritual meant actually knowing how to walk without getting lost and making sure the corn didn't die. Try explaining to an elder that your spiritual practice is mindfulness apps. They'd probably laugh and hand you a stick. pointing at the stars, saying, "Mind this instead." The blending of navigation and spirituality made life cohesive. You didn't need to separate survival from meaning. Walking east wasn't just heading east. It was starting anew. Following the Milky Way wasn't just heading north-south. It was retracing the path of souls. The ordinary and the sacred braided so tightly that you could never untangle them. And when colonial disruption came, that braid was tested. Paper maps and compasses were forced into landscapes that already had their own systems. The irony is sharp. Outsiders thought they were bringing order, but in reality, they were unraveling a cosmology that had already ordered everything. When European colonists pushed their grids, compasses, and parchment across the continent, they weren't introducing maps to a blank slate. They were imposing one world view over another. Indigenous nations already had maps, except theirs weren't folded and inked. They were oral, celestial, ecological, and spiritual. To the colonists, that didn't count. To the people living it, it was everything. The shift was brutal. Paper maps demanded borders, fixed lines, and property divisions. Star knowledge had always been about movement, cycles, and relationship. Colonists wanted ownership stamped onto land. Indigenous traditions treated land as a living partner, aligned with the heavens. The conflict wasn't just practical, it was cosmological. One side reduced the world to squares, the other saw it as a living network. Guess which one survives better in the long run of human sanity? And yet, the star traditions didn't vanish. They slipped underground, reshaped, sometimes hidden in ceremonies disguised for colonial eyes. During the forced migrations westward, like the Trail of Tears, oral accounts suggest some groups still looked to the heavens for direction, refusing to rely entirely on the guides sent by governments that had just displaced them. Knowledge carried in story doesn't need official approval to survive. It only needs memory, and memory is stubborn. Syncretism also appeared. As Christianity spread, some native communities blended biblical imagery with existing celestial traditions. The Star of Bethlehem was read through the same eyes that once watched Venus. The Milky Way, as Spirit Road, still lingered, even when spoken in hushed tones. Colonization may have forced new stories, but it couldn't erase the sky. And as long as the stars kept rising, old patterns remained accessible. Anthropologists in the 19th and 20th centuries documented elders still teaching constellations as navigation aids, while colonists obsessed over railroads and straight roads that cut across everything. Indigenous voices reminded anyone listening that the real guidance still hung overhead. The irony couldn't be sharper. Colonizers obsessed with progress often got lost without their maps, while the very people they dismissed could orient themselves in forests, deserts, or coasts simply by memory of sky and earth. Even today, many native educators frame the recovery of star knowledge as both cultural revival and resistance. To learn again how the Pleiades set, how Orion tilts, how solstices align with sacred sites, it isn't just nostalgia. It's reclaiming a way of knowing the world that colonial grids tried to flatten. Colonization didn't destroy star navigation. It scarred it, forced it into quiet places, but couldn't eliminate the fact that Polaris still shines, that the Milky Way still stretches overhead, that children can still be taught to look up and read. Ink fades, paper burns, but the heavens remain untouchable. And if archaeology and ethnography have anything to say about it, we can still trace those alignments, those petroglyphs, those stone observatories that prove sky knowledge wasn't a quaint superstition. It was science etched into land, waiting for us to notice. Proof doesn't always come in stories. Sometimes it's carved into stone, staring right back at us with the patience of 1,000 years. If you wander into Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, you'll find walls and windows that don't just line up with convenience, they line up with solstices, equinoxes, and lunar standstills. Pueblo peoples weren't guessing at the sky. They were engineering entire cities as observatories. That's not mysticism. That's architecture doing astronomy without ever needing a telescope. Petroglyphs scattered across the southwest show starbursts, crescents, and spirals that match celestial events. Some scholars connect a particular sunburst carving to the supernova of 1054, an explosion so bright it outshone the moon. Imagine seeing a star suddenly appear in the sky, dazzling the night, and then marking it permanently in stone so future generations would remember. That's less primitive doodle and more scientific journal entry chiseled into rock. Maya and Inca sites farther south show similar alignments, but in North America, the evidence has its own flavor. At Fajada Butte, shafts of light slice across carved spirals during solstices, a deliberate design that turns stone into a calendar. Hopi and Zuni oral traditions back up these alignments, describing how star risings marked ritual cycles. The cross-confirmation between story and architecture is hard to ignore. If one fails, the other picks it up. Ethnographies in the 19th and 20th centuries, often dismissive, accidentally left us treasure troves of data. They wrote down how the Pawnee aligned villages with the stars, how the Lakota described the Black Hills as mirroring constellations above, how Navajo stories encoded astronomical cycles. These notes, condescending as they sometimes read, now serve as confirmation that sky knowledge wasn't romantic, invention it was real, practiced, essential. And here's the kicker. Many of these sites and stories weren't discovered by archaeologists. They were rediscovered after centuries of being ignored, while communities themselves kept remembering. The stone was always there. The stories were always there. Academia just needed to catch up, like the last guest at a feast who finally realizes everyone else already ate. The irony piles up. Modern people drive hours to visit observatories, then gawk at the very same alignments indigenous builders made, with nothing more than eyes, patience, and memory. Ask a Pueblo elder why a wall lines up with the solstice, and you'll get an answer calm enough to make you feel foolish, because the sun rises there. Sometimes the simplest explanation is also the most sophisticated. Archaeology and ethnography prove what oral traditions never stopped saying, that the sky was always the map, and the earth itself was inked with its reflections. But while the stones and petroglyphs stand silent, communities are once again giving them voice, teaching younger generations that what outsiders call ruins were never abandoned. They were notes in a living conversation between land and sky, and that conversation hasn't ended. In fact, it's being revived with new urgency. Elders, educators, and even planetariums are now weaving those same constellations back into daily life, showing that ancestral navigation isn't just history, it's still alive above our heads. The stars haven't changed, but the way we look at them has. In cities, most people can barely see Orion's belt through the haze of streetlights, let alone the faint shimmer of the Pleiades. Meanwhile, native educators are reviving sky knowledge, teaching children to look up and read what their great-grandparents read, without books or batteries. Some of this happens in classrooms, some in ceremonies, and sometimes even in planetariums, where constellations once erased by colonial astronomy are finally named in indigenous languages again. For the Lakota, the Black Hills are still understood as a mirror of the heavens above. The Pawnee's morning star traditions, documented in dusty ethnographies, are now spoken aloud in new generations. Pueblo ceremonies continue to mark the movement of the sun and stars, aligning ritual with cosmos just as their ancestors built stone alignments centuries ago. None of this is dead tradition, it's living science, still practiced, still relevant. And here's where the irony bites one last time. Modern people rely on satellites orbiting Earth to tell them which highway exit to take. Meanwhile, the very communities once dismissed as lacking maps still carry the memory of how to cross continents using nothing but the night sky. Strip away the satellites, and who's actually lost? Legacy today isn't only cultural revival, it's scientific recognition. Universities collaborate with elders, astronomers acknowledge oral traditions, and young native voices point out what should have been obvious all along. Sky knowledge wasn't superstition, it was data, observation, memory. And unlike paper maps that mold in damp basements, the stars are still right there, waiting for anyone who cares to learn. But the revival isn't just about accuracy, it's about identity. To look up and call the Milky Way by its native name, to trace Orion's belt as an ancestral road rather than a hunter's belt, is to reject the idea that history erased you. The heavens themselves insist otherwise. They hold the stories still. So if you'd been born into that lineage, you'd inherit a sky full of meaning, not empty decoration. Every night would be a lesson, every sunrise a reminder, every constellation a family member whispering directions. And when someone asked where your map was, you'd just tilt your head back and laugh, because the biggest, clearest, most indestructible map was stretched across the heavens, free of charge, always above your head. Long before charts and printed calendars, the night sky functioned as both schedule and scripture. Patterns of stars, the sun's tilt, and the moon's cycles weren't abstract curiosities for idle stargazers. They were the organizing principles of daily life. In communities across the Americas, celestial knowledge wasn't ornamental, it was survival-grade intelligence. A misread constellation could mean planting too soon, hunting too late, or celebrating a ritual on the wrong day and risking both famine and spiritual imbalance. The heavens offered no margin for error, only precise reminders of when to move and when to wait. The logic was simple enough. The sky was the only constant. Rivers shifted course, forests burned or grew back, herds wandered, but Orion always rose on schedule. The Pleiades disappeared into the sun's glare and returned right on time, year after year, never late, never early. Their reliability made them better guides than any earthbound marker. No tree, no trail, no river bend carried the same authority as the glittering dome above. Stars, after all, couldn't be stolen, broken, or bribed into lying. This wasn't science divorced from spirituality. It was an all-encompassing system where cosmology and ecology fused seamlessly. Among Pueblo farmers, the heliacal rising of constellations marked agricultural beginnings. For the Pawnee, specific stars were woven into ceremonial life, linking the hunt to cosmic order. The Lakota saw the Black Hills as a terrestrial reflection of the heavens, blurring the line between earthly geography and celestial architecture. The point wasn't to separate myth from method, but to braid them so tightly together that following the stars became both practical necessity and moral duty. Knowledge of these cycles was never locked in scrolls or private libraries. It lived in memory, carried in songs, stories, and rituals repeated until they became impossible to forget. A tale of a trickster scattering stars across the sky doubled as a mnemonic for when the bison herds moved. A chant honoring the morning star preserved instructions for timing, planting, and hunting. Oral tradition ensured that celestial literacy was communal, not the guarded secret of specialists. The night sky was visible to everyone. What mattered was the discipline to interpret it correctly. The irony, of course, is how colonial observers often dismissed such practices as superstition, blind to the fact that these same superstitions kept communities alive in landscapes European maps failed to describe. A printed almanac might wilt in rain, but the stars remained legible through every storm, every migration, every generation. Indigenous astronomy didn't need parchment. It was etched into the fabric of existence itself. Yet this framework wasn't static. It adapted constantly, refined by centuries of observation. When animal migrations shifted, the stories shifted too, weaving ecological change into cosmic narrative. When new rituals developed, they aligned with celestial markers already trusted for centuries. The system absorbed change without breaking, because it never claimed to be rigid, it claimed to be relational. But celestial knowledge wasn't just about crops or ceremonies. It governed movement across landscapes as well. Herds, birds, and fish rarely waited for humans to catch up, and the timing of their migrations depended on cosmic cycles no less than planting seasons did. And so, what started as a calendar quickly became a map, stars dictating not only when to act, but where to go. Celestial cycles didn't just tell people when to plant, they told them when animals would move. Herds, flocks, and fish were as bound to the sky as crops, and hunters learned quickly that chasing blindly meant failure. Successful hunting required timing, and timing meant watching the heavens. On the plains, bison migrations were understood in relation to star patterns. The appearance of the Pleiades before dawn, for example, signaled seasonal shifts not just for farmers but for hunters who knew the herds followed grass growth linked to the same cycles. The return of Orion in the winter sky wasn't simply a celestial ornament. It aligned with colder months when animals moved in predictable patterns, offering both opportunity and warning. Stars became the silent announcers of migrations long before hoofbeats thundered across the horizon. Birds, too, were read through the heavens. Geese cutting south in V-shapes weren't just random travelers. They mirrored the seasonal arc of the constellations above. Observers saw the patterns as echoes of each other, the flight of wings on Earth, repeating the movement of stars overhead. Hunters who recognized these correspondences didn't need compasses or maps. The sky already whispered where the animals would be. And in coastal regions, fish migrations followed similar rules. Communities timed their harvests of salmon, sturgeon, or eels to celestial events. A cluster's rising might mean the fish were entering rivers. A moon phase might tell when the tides would carry them in abundance. The heavens were less a backdrop and more an active partner in the hunt, ensuring nets were cast at the right moment. What makes this striking is the precision. These weren't vague associations like stars equals animals. They were tested correlations, refined over centuries of observation. Generations learned, corrected, and embedded knowledge into ritual to ensure memory didn't slip. A child might hear a story about a star ancestor chasing an animal spirit, and within the myth was a coded lesson. When that star rose, the hunt began. Knowledge wasn't delivered as a manual, it was disguised as narrative, ensuring it lived in memory long after formal instruction was forgotten. The moon joined in, adding layers of meaning to hunting strategies. Bright phases illuminated prey, while dark moons cloaked hunters in shadow. Communities scheduled hunts accordingly, aware that success depended not only on animal behavior, but also on lunar light. What seems like folklore to outsiders was in fact finely tuned environmental science expressed through celestial metaphor. European chroniclers rarely recognized this sophistication. They saw rituals before hunt songs, fasting, offerings, and assumed them wasteful superstition. What they missed was the calibration happening underneath. The ritual wasn't a distraction, but the transmission of astronomical timing. Ceremony wasn't separate from strategy. It was the strategy. By aligning hunts with celestial cycles, communities ensured that their actions didn't just extract from the environment, but synchronized with it. The hunt became a negotiation between human need, animal rhythm, and cosmic order. Missing the signs meant more than hunger, it meant failing to uphold the balance between all three, and that balance wasn't restricted to animals alone. The moon, with its waxing and waning, didn't just determine whether hunters stalked by light or shadow. It also shaped rituals performed before and after, tying the cycle of prey to cycles of worship. The moon wasn't a passive light bulb in the night sky. It was a strict timekeeper, dictating when a hunt began and how it unfolded. Bright, swollen moons spread silver light across plains and forests, exposing both predator and prey. Hunters knew to stalk differently under that glow, sometimes waiting, sometimes using it to their advantage, sometimes avoiding it entirely. A dark, moonless night, by contrast, wrapped them in shadow, perfect for ambush but demanding sharper instincts. Communities learned to read these cycles with ruthless accuracy. Among many groups, full moons earned names tied to hunting and subsistence. Harvest moon, hunter's moon, snow moon. Each name was less poetic than it was practical, reminding everyone that celestial timing wasn't optional. When the hunter's moon rose fat and orange, deer fattened on autumn crops, easier to track in fields glowing faintly under lunar light. Ignore that signal, and you weren't just being romantic, you were being inefficient. Lunar phases shaped more than tactics. They decided ritual schedules surrounding the hunt. Certain ceremonies were performed only under specific moons, acknowledging that the animal world moved in concert with lunar light. A hunt launched at the wrong phase risked more than failure. It risked offending the very balanced thought to make animals appear in the first place. The line between practical ecology and cosmic responsibility blurred until they were indistinguishable. Consider the stark pragmatism here. A bright moonlit night made stalking nearly impossible. Too much visibility, too much risk of scaring off game. Instead, hunters used it for preparation, sharpening tools, setting traps, readying arrows. The dark moon, on the other hand, cloaked every movement. That was when risks were taken. Trails followed, prey flushed. Efficiency wasn't coincidence. It was choreography between human behavior and lunar rhythm. European chroniclers, again, often saw the ceremonies without grasping the precision behind them. They wrote about dances under the moon, songs to animal spirits, offerings made in the night. What they rarely understood was that these weren't distractions from hunting, but the encoded memory system that kept lunar cycles tied to survival. Ritual was the vessel. Timing was the cargo. The moon also governed water. Tides rose and fell under its pull, shaping fishing practices along coasts and rivers. Casting nets at the wrong tide, under the wrong moon, meant empty baskets. Aligning with the right phase meant abundance. Fishermen didn't need astronomy charts, they needed memory, stories, and observation, all wrapped in lunar cycles. This constant reliance on the moon gave it a presence that was never merely decorative. It was both ally and enforcer, the one cosmic body that shifted fast enough to remind people weekly of its power. To ignore it was reckless, to honor it was survival. And when constellations entered the picture, timing grew even more elaborate. Orion's belt wasn't just a set of stars, it became a calendar pointer, linking celestial landmarks to hunting seasons, reinforcing what the moon already dictated. The hunt wasn't guided by one light alone, but by a chorus of heavens working together. If the moon dictated rhythm in weeks, constellations stretched that rhythm across seasons. Patterns like Orion, the Pleiades, and the Big Dipper weren't idle sky doodles, they were clocks too large to ignore, calibrated to migrations, harvests, and rituals that spanned entire communities. Orion's belt, 3 stars strung neatly in a line, appeared in the night sky when winter was pressing in. Its rising and setting coincided with periods when certain animals grew leaner and moved in more predictable routes. Hunters timed their strategies around those appearances, knowing that Orion's return meant game would too. The constellation wasn't just a hunter in the sky, as Greeks liked to imagine it, was a practical reminder. Sharpen your weapons, the season is shifting. The Pleiades carried similar weight. The heliacal rising in late summer or early autumn signaled major transitions across the continent. Farmers used it to time crops. Hunters used it to anticipate fattened game or bird migrations. The cluster was so central that many nations wove stories about lost children or ancestral figures into its faint shimmer. Those stories weren't idle myths, they were mnemonic devices, ensuring no one forgot the critical link between stars and survival. The Big Dipper, wheeling around Polaris, served as a nightly compass and a seasonal clock. Its rotation across the horizon tracked the passage of months, signaling both the direction to travel and the kind of hunts that would be possible. At a glance, its orientation told whether the year was new, maturing, or nearing its end. Imagine carrying an entire year's planner above your head, visible every clear night. What's striking isn't just the astronomy, but the pedagogy. These cycles weren't taught in sterile charts. They were embedded in myth, performance, and story. A child might hear that Orion's belt was a row of hunters chasing prey across the sky. Hidden in that tale was a reminder. When those stars rose in the evening sky, real hunts should begin on Earth. The myth was sticky, memorable. The ecological fact slipped in beneath it. European observers often dismissed these connections as quaint folklore, not realizing they were watching ecological calendars disguised in narrative form. That dismissal says more about the observers than the observed. After all, no one mocked an almanac for giving farming advice in print. Yet here were entire communities encoding the same precision into stories that survived centuries without paper. The irony is sharp. European explorers sometimes lost track of time entirely in new landscapes, confused by unfamiliar seasons. Indigenous communities, meanwhile, carried cosmic calendars above them every night, reminding them when to move, when to wait, when to hunt. Which one sounds like the more sophisticated system? But constellations weren't only about subsistence, they also aligned with ceremony, ensuring rituals harmonized with ecological abundance. When the stars declared it time to hunt, they also declared it time to honor the spirits who made the hunt possible. Practical timing and sacred duty walked hand in hand, and those sacred duties came into sharp focus when the sun itself was brought into the equation. Because while stars told hunters when to act, solar markers carved rituals into stone, anchoring ceremonies in light that fell exactly where it was meant to. Stars gave hunters their seasons, but the sun was the tyrant that governed ceremony. Its slow crawl along the horizon set the stage for planting, harvest, and ritual, and people built entire landscapes of stone to catch its movements. Solar markers weren't decorative architecture, they were giant clocks, patient and exacting, that ordered communal life. In Chaco Canyon, shafts of light cut through stone slits during solstices, striking spiral carvings at the exact moment the year turned. Pueblo priests stood in those shadows, waiting for confirmation from the sun itself, before announcing the next round of ceremonies. This wasn't guesswork, it was architectural astronomy, crafted with such precision that even modern archaeologists still marvel at how stone and light danced together. Cahokia, near today's Est. Louis, had its own solar observatory's Woodhenge circles, where posts aligned with solstice, sunrises and sunsets. From those markers, ritual calendars were proclaimed, synchronizing hunts, feasts, and offerings with cosmic rhythm. Communities didn't treat the sun's path as abstract geometry. They treated it as a living dialogue. When the sun reached its turning point, so did the rituals below. The logic extended beyond monumental sites. Farmers and hunters alike paid attention to where the sun rose and set along local horizons. A mountain peak might mark the solstice. A notch in a ridge might frame the equinox. Every year, when the sun touched that spot, life pivoted. The hunt shifted, rituals began, and ceremonies bound communities together under the authority of celestial light. What's striking is the double duty. These alignments weren't just practical, they carried enormous symbolic weight. A solstice wasn't only a good time to plan crops or track herds. It was a cosmic hinge, the moment when the balance of light and dark demanded recognition. Rituals performed then weren't luxuries. They were obligations, binding humans to the order of the universe. European colonists, arriving with their own calendars, often sneered at such practices, missing the point entirely. They saw dances and offerings, but not the embedded astronomy. They called the rituals superstition, then promptly planted wheat in the wrong season and wondered why the land refused to cooperate. It's a kind of irony only history can write, mocking the system that works while clinging to the one that fails. The solar cycle made hunting more than a matter of arrows and spears. It framed it as ceremony. Before hunts began, fasting and offerings tied the act of killing to the turning of the year. Afterward, feasts returned gratitude to the same forces that had timed the hunt in the first place. The sun wasn't just a ball of fire. It was the guarantor that rituals and hunts remained aligned, and once ceremony set the stage, the hunters themselves had to prepare. No one walked into the woods casually. The act of hunting demanded purification, fasting, and ritual observance, all carefully tied to the same cycles that ordered crops and stars. No hunt began with the simple tightening of bowstrings or the sharpening of blades. It began in silence, fasting, and gestures meant to align human bodies with cosmic rhythm. Preparation was as much ritual as it was practical, because animals weren't thought of as mere resources to be taken at will. They were agents in a relationship, and the stars and sun were the mediators of that contract. Fasting stripped hunters of excess, purifying them before stepping into the act of taking life. Songs were sung not to pass time but to request cooperation from animal spirits, from ancestors, from the sky itself. Offerings of tobacco, cornmeal, or carved tokens were left at thresholds, on the edge of forests, at river crossings, beneath open skies where constellations flickered faintly. Each act admitted a truth that success in the hunt was never guaranteed by skill alone, but by respect. Timing mattered. Certain rituals were only performed under specific phases of the moon, or when stars signaled that the season had truly arrived. A hunter who ignored these cues risked not only failure but imbalance. If the Pleiades rose and no preparation was made, the mistake wasn't just personal, it threatened the harmony between people, prey, and the cosmic order. The gestures could be small washing hands in river water at dawn, whispering prayers before lifting a bow. They could also be elaborate, involving dances that imitated the movements of animals soon to be hunted. In both cases, the purpose was the same: to enter the hunt as ceremony, not as simple predation. European witnesses often wrote about these practices with condescension, describing them as superstitions that wasted valuable time. What they missed was that this ritual discipline wasn't ornamental, it was ecological. By restricting hunts to specific celestial and ceremonial windows, communities ensured they weren't over-harvesting the stars, the moon, the rituals. Together they formed a regulatory system. What looked like mysticism was, in practice, sustainable management disguised as sacred duty. Failure to prepare properly was more than a tactical error. It was an ethical breach. An animal taken without ceremony was considered a wound to the order of things, a disrespect that could bring scarcity in seasons to come. Hunters carried that knowledge heavily, their rituals serving as both shield and reminder. And within those rituals lived a recognition that animals themselves had celestial ties. Deer, bison, birds, they weren't just flesh and bone. They were also spirits whose patterns mirrored the heavens. The hunt, in this sense, wasn't a one-way act of taking. It was a dialogue, enacted under the gaze of constellations that carried the very images of those animals above. So every hunt began before the chase, long before the first arrow flew. in quiet alignment with cycles far older than any human memory. And that alignment carried into the very way animals were perceived not as random prey, but as part of a cosmic order mirrored in the stars. The hunt wasn't imagined as a duel between man and beast. It was staged more like a negotiation conducted under the supervision of the sky. Animals carried spirits, and those spirits were tied to celestial forms. To take a deer, a bison, or a bird wasn't only to draw blood, it was to engage in a relationship that echoed patterns above. Constellations often embodied these connections. The Pleiades, faint as a smudge, became children or animals in story, guiding the timing of hunts below. Orion, with its prominent belt, wasn't just a human hunter in local traditions, but a symbol of pursuit, reminding people that chase and prey were part of a larger rhythm. Even the Milky Way was more than a scatter of stars, was a road where souls of both people and animals traveled, binding mortal life to cosmic order. When hunters sang to deer or spoke prayers to bison, they weren't being sentimental. They were acknowledging this cosmic kinship. The animal wasn't just game, it was a participant in a shared balance, one mirrored in the heavens. To kill carelessly risked disrupting that balance, and the punishment wouldn't come in the form of angry priests, but in something far harsher: absence. Animals would stop appearing, herds would thin. The sky, it was believed, would withhold its gifts. This belief didn't dilute the hunt, it sharpened it. Every arrow loosed carried both weight and humility. Hunters entered with the knowledge that they weren't owed anything. They had to earn it through respect, observance, and timing aligned with celestial cycles. To walk into a hunt without ritual was arrogance. To succeed without respect was a curse in disguise. European accounts often recorded this with bafflement. They noted how hunters spoke to prey before or after death, thanking it or offering tobacco. To outsiders it looked like wasted words over dead bodies. What they couldn't see was the deeper logic. Each gesture preserved the understanding that the hunt was not conquest but covenant, and that covenant extended into the stars, where animals and humans were part of the same cosmological order. The eerie beauty of this view is that nothing was isolated. A bison herd wasn't just meat, it was the earthly reflection of cycles mapped above. A bird in migration was an echo of a constellation wheeling across the horizon. Taking one life was never just immediate, it resonated with an order that stretched beyond vision into the cosmos itself. And because of this, the rituals after the hunt often reenacted celestial events. Movements of dancers, masks, chansol became performances of the same order that stars carried silently overhead. The kill was never the end. It was the beginning of ceremony, mirroring cosmic cycles to restore balance. The kill was never the last act. It was the prologue to a performance that returned the hunt to its cosmic framework. Once animals had been taken, communities stepped into ritual spaces where the heavens were reenacted on earth. Dances spiraled like constellations, chants rose and fell with the rhythm of stars, and masks transformed ordinary bodies into celestial beings. The hunt ended not in silence, but in cosmic theater. These reenactments weren't idle pageantry. They were precise acts of synchronization, meant to restore balance between the human world and the cosmic order. If animals mirrored stars, then taking them required humans to mirror stars as well, closing the cycle in performance. A deer might be honored with dances imitating its leaps under starlight. A bird might be recalled in a mask and winged gesture, tracing arcs that mimicked both flight and constellation. The hunt wasn't erased, it was transformed into ceremony that anchored it safely in cosmic lore. Architecture reinforced this stagecraft. In Pueblo communities, rituals often unfolded in kivas aligned with celestial markers, ensuring that movements inside mirrored the sun and stars outside. The choreography of human bodies was therefore not random. It was bound to the same geometry traced by light and shadow across stone. Every step had consequence, every turn a reflection. Myths, too, were retold during these ceremonies, weaving astronomical events into living memory. A star that rose at dawn became an ancestor who sacrificed themselves for the hunt. A constellation that dipped below the horizon became the animal offering itself willingly. These stories weren't recited as entertainment. They were the manuals of the ritual, ensuring no detail was lost, no cosmic thread ignored. European witnesses often dismissed the dancing as elaborate nonsense, blind to the way each step, each beat of a drum, carried centuries of ecological data encoded in symbolism. What seemed like costumes and chanting was, in practice, a mnemonic system of remembering when animals returned, when plants ripened, when ceremonies had to be performed again. The absurdity lies not in the ritual but in the observers who couldn't see its logic. The reenactments also doubled as teaching. Children, watching from the sidelines, absorbed the choreography long before they ever memorized a star chart. When their time came, they didn't just know when Orion rose, they knew the story of how his rising aligned with the hunt. Because they'd watched it danced 100 times. Memory passed not through ink, but through movement, sound, and repetition. This embodied knowledge ensured survival. Each ritual was a living calendar, one you could feel in your bones as much as see in the sky. The constellations above and the dancers below mirrored each other, creating a dialogue between heaven and earth. That dialogue kept the cycles intact, and through those cycles, teaching never stopped. Elders used stars, myths, and rituals together to ensure the next generation could hunt without breaking the balance, carrying forward knowledge as old as the constellations themselves. Knowledge of the sky wasn't stored in books or locked away in temples. It was carried across generations in stories, ceremonies, and pointed fingers toward the horizon. Elders became living atlases, their wrinkles as familiar as the constellations they described. A grandfather might sit with children by a fire, drawing Orion's belt into the dust with a stick, while a grandmother told how the Pleiades vanished and returned, marking the right time to plant, hunt, or gather. Each gesture turned starlight into memory, and memory into survival. The method was elegant because it was embodied. Children didn't simply hear that the hunt begins when this star rises. They watched it dramatized in ritual, danced in masks, sung in chants. The data was sticky, lodged in rhythm and repetition. Forgetting was nearly impossible because forgetting wasn't allowed. The stories were woven into every communal act, from feasts to fasts to nightly conversations under the open sky. Oral tradition carried more than timing. It carried the ethics of hunting, the responsibility of preparation, the humility before animal spirits. A child watching an elder sprinkle tobacco on the ground before a hunt wasn't only learning a gesture, they were learning that prey arrived as gift, not entitlement. The sky confirmed this by its cycles, reinforcing what the elder enacted on earth. It wasn't casual instruction, the stakes were survival. A mistimed hunt could mean hunger, a neglected ritual could mean imbalance, and both risks were too great to leave to improvisation. So the teaching had layers. Myth made it memorable, ritual made it communal, and the stars themselves offered constant, silent verification. If a child ever doubted the story, they could look up and see the constellation rising exactly when the tale said it would. Story and sky agreed, eliminating room for doubt. European chroniclers occasionally noted how children learned constellations at astonishingly young ages, able to point out patterns with fluency that rivaled any school-trained astronomer. They weren't memorizing sterile charts. They were living inside a cosmos where every hunt, every crop, every ritual demanded literacy in the sky. It wasn't a choice, it was daily reality. This teaching also bred continuity. When a community was displaced, the sky followed them. Even when landscapes shifted, stars remained constant, anchoring memory to something unchanging. A child carried the heavens as portable knowledge, a compass no exile could erase. That resilience was the secret strength of oral astronomy. It could travel, adapt, and persist even under pressure. The eerie part is how efficient it all was. No classrooms, no textbooks, no exams, just firelight, stories, rituals, and stars. And yet, it created generations fluent in a cosmic system, sophisticated enough to time migrations, predict animal movements, and sustain ceremonies across centuries. Forget literacy in letters. This was literacy in light. And as those teachings traveled forward, they didn't remain frozen in time. They absorbed change, weathered colonization, and transformed into revival movements today. Proof that celestial knowledge, once embedded, never really dies. It only waits for the next teacher to point upward. Colonization pressed hard against these systems, drawing borders on maps that ignored the sky and dismissing ceremonies as quaint distractions. Paper calendars and compasses were forced into landscapes that already had their own clocks and compasses written in starlight. Yet the sky itself refused to be colonized, and memory proved far more stubborn than ink. Celestial knowledge slipped underground, disguised in rituals, whispered in stories, and carried in the bodies of those who still pointed upward. Some practices endured quietly. Hunters continued to track migrations by stars and moons, even when outsiders insisted on different methods. Rituals aligned with solstices persisted, sometimes hidden beneath Christian veneers, their timing unchanged beneath the surface. Children kept learning constellations, not from textbooks, but from elders who refused to forget. A story told in secret still carried the same data. When the Pleiades rise, when Orion returns, when the cycle of hunt and ceremony begins again. Archaeology and ethnography, centuries later, confirmed what had never stopped being true. Petroglyphs matched star events, villages aligned with solstices, oral accounts mapped directly onto celestial cycles. What colonial systems dismissed as superstition now revealed itself as empirical, ecological science expressed in narrative form. Irony piled high. The unscientific methods outlasted the so-called progress of almanacs and maps that failed to survive without preservation. Today, revival movements stitch those threads back into the present. Native educators teach astronomy not as imported knowledge but as ancestral science. Planetariums project constellations with indigenous names, restoring voices to patterns long overwritten. Rituals tied to solstices and lunar phases are performed again, their meaning undimmed by centuries of suppression. What once was survival practice is now also cultural resistance, proof that the sky remembers what paper tried to erase. The transformation isn't romantic nostalgia, it's continuity. When people look up and see not Orion but the spirit of a hunter tied to animal migrations, they aren't inventing new myths. They're returning to a literacy older than colonial maps, one that never vanished because the evidence hung overhead every night. Celestial cycles guided hunts and rituals for millennia, and they still do, in ways adapted, remembered, and revived. The sun continues its solstice crawl, the moon waxes and wanes, the stars wheel predictably. Human memory, fragile as it is, attached itself to that permanence and endured. The continuity lies not in unbroken ritual, but in the unbroken sky, and that's the final irony. Colonization could redraw borders, rename rivers, topple temples, and silence ceremonies, but it couldn't stop the Pleiades from rising. It couldn't change Orion's belt. The very cosmos became a form of resistance, an eternal reminder that long before compasses and maps, the hunt and the ritual already belonged to the stars. The first problem with maps in vast territories was scale, a word that looks neat on paper but falls apart once you step into a prairie, a desert, or a stretch of tundra where the horizon keeps running away from you. A hand-sized drawing can suggest that a line represents a river or that a blotch marks a mountain, but in reality, those rivers could twist for weeks, and the mountain range might take days to cross even when you think you're close enough to touch it. What looks manageable on parchment grows monstrous on the ground. Travelers who trusted their maps quickly discovered how badly paper compresses reality. A line between two dots might mean 10 days of walking across grassland, so monotonous you'd start hallucinating landmarks that didn't exist. Early explorers learned the hard way that you can't fold the prairie into a pocket, no matter how fine the ink. The ground insists on its enormity, and paper insists on pretending it isn't there. Vast landscapes made mockery of precision. On the Great Plains, there were no walls, no hedges, nothing to anchor your sense of progress. You could walk for hours with the sun at your side and feel you hadn't moved at all. On the tundra, snow erased everything except sky and ice, leaving you in an endless white, where even footprints vanished behind you. A map might promise a day's travel north, but days lengthen strangely when the world offers no frame of reference. The land itself swallowed the neatness of lines. Cartographers tried to fix the problem with symbols, compressing distances into tidy scales. But a mountain drawn an inch high on paper doesn't capture the way its ridges split into endless gullies, each one demanding another hour, another climb. Rivers sketched as blue curves didn't show the way they flooded, shifted, or cut new courses. The reality of the land mocked the arrogance of scale, turning maps into suggestions at best and outright lies at worst. For indigenous peoples who lived inside these expanses, the very idea of scale as an abstraction was irrelevant. Knowledge wasn't flattened onto paper. It was carried in memory, in story, in roots, sung and repeated. Vastness wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a condition of life, accepted and navigated without needing to shrink it into a rectangle. A hunter didn't need to know how far 100 miles stretched. He needed to know when the herds would appear and which stars rose above the prairie grass at that season. The land wasn't measured, it was lived. What makes the irony sharper is how Europeans clung to their maps as proof of control. To draw the land was to claim it, even if the drawing had no resemblance to what lay beneath the sky. Borders were inked with confidence, whole territories declared known, when in practice, the men carrying those maps stumbled blindly through regions that refused to conform. Paper conquered more quickly than boots, but the conquest existed only in imagination. The scale of the land wasn't just large, it was actively hostile to the notion of being scaled down. Every attempt to compress it collapsed under its sheer physicality. Maps shrank reality into symbols, and the land laughed back, stretching into distances that ignored human convenience. And when the horizon refused to behave, the next problem emerged, not just the size of the territory, but its uncanny refusal to offer fixed landmarks at all. If sheer size made maps absurd, the absence of reliable landmarks made them cruel. Maps thrive on permanence: mountains, rivers, coastlines, features that behave long enough to be drawn and trusted. But vast territories often refuse to play along. Plains stretched in indistinguishable waves of grass. Dunes shifted overnight under the push of desert winds, and tundra erased itself every winter, covering paths and rivers with sheets of ice that left no trace of what lay beneath. On the Great Plains, one hill blended into another until the idea of the hill by the river lost all meaning. In the Arctic, ridges of snow moved like sluggish glaciers, so a route followed in January looked nothing like the same route in March. Even rivers, supposedly the most reliable guides, betrayed travelers. They flooded, shifted their beds, or split into braids that merged again miles downstream, making a mockery of whatever neat blue line a cartographer had sketched. Paper insisted on stability. The ground refused it. For communities living inside these mutable environments, reliance on fixed markers was laughable. You didn't navigate by saying walk until you see that hill. You learned instead to watch the wind, to know the tilt of the sun at a certain time of year, to read animal trails and plant growth as signs more faithful than a distant ridge that might vanish in fog. Orientation came from patterns in sky and land that repeated across time, not from landmarks that disappeared like tricks of the light. European explorers, dependent on visible anchors, often wrote about their confusion with alarming honesty. Plains without end, deserts without feature, forests so thick every tree appeared the same. They got lost, not because they lacked intelligence, but because their maps required stability, and the landscapes they crossed offered none. A map that shows 3 days north to the mountains collapses when the mountains remain invisible until the 4th day, and the river that was meant to be your guide has carved a new channel in the meantime. It's no accident that oral navigation systems rarely relied on fixed features alone. Stories told of how stars rose above horizons, how certain birds flew in certain seasons, how winds carried smells of salt or pine depending on direction. These cues couldn't be washed away by floods or hidden by snow. They endured when landmarks failed, building a system far more resilient than lines on a page. The eerie part is how fragile European mapping traditions looked against these environments. Paper seemed sophisticated until it faced a river that changed its course, or a dune that swallowed an entire campsite overnight. Indigenous knowledge, dismissed as primitive, proved to be the only thing capable of keeping pace with landscapes that refused to hold still. And when you add the cycles of seasons, the futility of fixed maps grows sharper, because even if you could capture a landmark in summer, it might vanish entirely under ice in winter, or reappear transformed when the floods came. The ground itself became a shapeshifter, erasing the illusion of permanence one season at a time. Even if someone managed to draw a map that looked accurate in July, the land itself rewrote it by December. Seasons didn't just change the scenery, they turned entire regions into different worlds, rendering paper useless as soon as the weather shifted. A frozen river in winter became a smooth highway, gleaming under starlight, only to melt into a violent churning obstacle by spring. What looked like a shortcut on ice turned into a death trap in water. Forests shifted with equal drama. Trails walked comfortably in late autumn disappeared under snow, so deep that trees themselves seemed rearranged. In deserts, the opposite occurred. Seasonal winds resculpted dunes overnight, erasing any path you thought you remembered. A landmark dune became a stranger by morning, its contours rewritten by wind. Cartographers, with their tidy lines and compass roses, had no way to capture this mutability. Even the prairie changed character with the seasons. Summer cloaked it in tall grass that whispered and rippled like a green sea. Winter stripped it bare, leaving a white expanse that mirrored the sky so perfectly it was hard to tell where horizon ended. A map could say walk east for one day, but east looked different every time the earth decided to alter its costume. Communities who lived within these cycles didn't try to freeze the land into permanent symbols. They memorized transformation instead. Songs carried instructions for crossing a river in winter versus in spring. Stories recalled when ice cracked loudest or when floods brought fish inland. Rituals aligned with these shifts, reminding everyone that survival wasn't about fixing the land on paper, but adapting to its seasonal moods. European travelers struggled most when they assumed permanence. They would follow a river confidently, guided by maps drawn in one season, only to find its path obliterated by floods or frozen solid. To the local inhabitants, this wasn't alarming, it was expected. The river had two personalities, one calm and navigable, the other furious and swollen. A map, however, could only depict one. The rest was left to chance or ignorance. The effect of seasonal transformation was eerie in its predictability. The land didn't hide its instability, it flaunted it, repeating patterns year after year. But to those who believed in fixed borders and static landscapes, the cycles felt like betrayal. What's a border worth if snow hides it for half the year? What's a trail worth if spring floods erase it every time? Maps clung to the illusion of stasis, while the earth insisted on movement. And because of this, navigation had to be cyclical too. Orientation wasn't about memorizing one landscape. It was about knowing the many faces a single landscape could wear across time. You didn't say, "This is the river." You said, "This is the river when it freezes," or "This is the river when it overflows." The land was plural, never singular, and only those who understood its transformations could move safely through it. But if the seasons rewrote the land, the constant migrations of animals and people layered even more instability over maps, making the very idea of fixed routes laughably inadequate. Even if the rivers would kindly stay in their channels and the dunes stop wandering, maps still collapsed under the weight of movement. Vast territories weren't just open land. They were highways for animals and people who never stayed still long enough to be fixed in ink. A map might tell you where a herd once grazed, but by the time you unfolded it again, the bison had thundered hundreds of miles away, leaving grass flattened and trails empty. Animal migrations made paper ridiculous. Caribou crossing tundra didn't read cartographers' intentions. They followed cycles written in stars, winds, and plant growth. Birds cut the sky in V-shapes, their routes shifting slightly each season, tied to food and climate in ways no ink could capture. Fish returned to rivers in great floods, but only during windows the moon and tides allowed. Try pinning any of this to a neat symbol, and you end up with a drawing that ages faster than bread in the sun. Human populations moved just as dynamically. Nomadic groups carried their homes with them, following herds, seasons, and trade. Villages relocated when soil grew tired, or when resources demanded a shift. These weren't people wandering aimlessly. They moved with purpose, in rhythm with cycles the land dictated. A European map showing a village here, or a camp there, was often obsolete by the time the ink dried. What was permanent settlement to outsiders was, to insiders, a temporary pulse in an ongoing circuit. To indigenous navigators, this mobility was never a problem. You didn't need to pin things down if you knew the cycles that governed movement. Stories reminded you when and where herds returned, how winds shifted, which trails opened or closed depending on the moon. Knowledge wasn't spatial in the way maps demanded. It was temporal, tied to rhythm, memory, and repetition. The important detail wasn't where something was, but when it would be there. European travelers, with their fixation on fixed points, grew exasperated. They wanted coordinates. They got patterns. They wanted permanence. they found flux. To them, maps were contracts with the land, this village here, this herd there, to the land and its people. The contract was always seasonal, always moving. The mismatch turned exploration into comedy. Settlers wandering to the coordinates of a known bison range, only to find prairie empty, while the animals grazed far to the north, under a sky that had already signaled the shift. The eerie part is how quickly mobility exposes the fragility of cartography. A map promises stability, but the very subjects it tries to capture, animals, rivers, people, refuse to hold still. To live in vast territories was to accept movement as the baseline, not the exception. Knowledge wasn't about pinning things down, it was about flowing with them. And this is why oral and celestial navigation systems thrived where maps failed. Stars and stories adapted effortlessly to rhythm and movement, offering guidance that didn't expire when the herds moved or the villages shifted. When the ground kept changing and the living things upon it refused to stay put, the only stable reference left was above. The sky became the great archive, a map so vast and consistent that it didn't matter if rivers wandered or bison herds vanished over the horizon. Stars rose where they always rose. The sun carved its arc with perfect loyalty, and the moon kept time like a metronome. Oral systems latched onto that permanence, weaving memory into story, song, and ritual, until orientation was carried not in parchment, but in bodies and voices. Wayfinding by stars wasn't abstract astronomy. It was survival boiled down to nightly observation. The Big Dipper wheeled around Polaris, turning the heavens into a compass that never needed sharpening. The heliacal rising of the Pleiades announced seasonal shifts, guiding hunters, farmers, and travelers alike. Even winds, carrying smells of pine or salt, became reliable cues when tied to celestial orientation. Nothing in this system expired. The sky renewed its instructions every single day. Oral tradition served as both classroom and library. A child could sit by a fire and hear a story about a hunter chasing a deer across the heavens, a tale that doubled as a mnemonic. When that star rose, deer would appear in the plains. Songs performed at seasonal gatherings weren't just entertainment, they were calendars. Their verses encoding when to travel, when to hunt, when to plant. The story might sound mythical, but the instruction underneath was razor sharp. For indigenous communities, this wasn't quaint folklore. It was their atlas. A star overhead was worth more than 10 lines on paper because it never shifted with floods, migrations, or snowstorms. Directions carried in chants and myths could be recalled anywhere, even when landmarks were erased. Knowledge didn't tear or rot in the rain, it lived in people. European explorers often failed to recognize the sophistication of these systems. They wrote about songs of navigation with a mixture of curiosity and dismissal, never realizing those very songs were more accurate than the maps they clutched. The irony is almost comedic. A man with a compass and parchment wandering, lost in the prairie, while a local elder could recite a story that guided directly to the next water source. One system demanded fragile tools, the other required only memory and sky. And perhaps most unsettling to the cartographic mind, oral systems thrived on fluidity. They didn't need to draw borders or fix villages to specific coordinates. They worked because they accepted movement, rhythm, and transformation as natural. A song could adapt to a shifting river in ways no ink could. A story could be retold with adjustments, absorbing new knowledge into old frameworks. Maps grew obsolete. Oral systems grew stronger. And yet, paper maps didn't only fail because of their rigidity. They failed too because they were fragile objects easily ruined, easily lost, and laughably unsuited to the harsh realities of vast and shifting territories. Even if a cartographer somehow captured every ridge, every bend in the river, every seasonal transformation, the map itself remained a fragile, sulky object. Paper hates weather, and vast territories never lacked for it. Rain turned ink into a bleeding mess. Snow made pages stiff, then brittle. Desert winds shredded parchment to ribbons. A map might promise mastery of the land, but the first storm reduced it to pulp. Durability was laughable compared to oral systems or celestial cues. Memory doesn't disintegrate in humidity. The stars don't smear when dropped in mud. By contrast, European explorers carried their precious folded rectangles as though they were charms, only to watch them dissolve at the first river crossing. Accounts describe maps so warped by damp saddlebags that entire valleys vanished into stains. The land remained constant, the map melted. Even when protected, maps deceived. Paper creased, tore, or simply wore away at the edges until distances blurred into nonsense. Ink faded, erasing landmarks as surely as floods erased riverbanks. A hole from a stray ember could eat an entire mountain range in one evening. There's a certain irony in declaring a territory conquered with a document that couldn't survive being sneezed on. Indigenous systems thrived precisely because they weren't physical objects. A star path carried in song couldn't be lost in transit. Directions memorized in myth didn't need to be unfolded. When European travelers misplaced their maps, they lost orientation entirely. When oral knowledge carriers died, their children already held the same songs, the same celestial anchors, ensuring continuity. Fragile paper couldn't compete with generational memory built into ritual. Colonial arrogance insisted on drawing lines anyway, but the absurdity was clear. Explorers clutching paper talismans while locals navigated seamlessly without needing tools at all. One system demanded protection from the environment, the other worked precisely because it was embedded in the environment. And yet, fragility wasn't just about rain or folds. It was also about the very idea that one universal map could exist in the first place. Paper implied that a single representation could serve everyone, but vast territories weren't universal. They were local, intimate, and known differently by every community that lived within them. Maps, by their very nature, pretend to be universal. One sheet of paper claims to speak for everyone, flattening landscapes into symbols that anyone can supposedly use. But vast territories laughed at this pretense. What mattered wasn't a bird's-eye sketch of thousands of miles. It was intimate familiarity with a single valley, a bend in the river, a trail that only appeared when snow melted. Precision didn't come from abstraction. It came from depth. Communities relied on knowledge so localized that outsiders often dismissed it as parochial, not realizing its accuracy was unmatched. A hunter might know which patch of prairie grass turned gold before bison arrived. A fisher could tell which inlet filled with salmon under a waning moon. A traveler recognized that a certain stand of pines always pointed toward water, even if it wasn't marked anywhere in ink. None of this translated onto paper, because paper insisted on generalization. European explorers carried universal maps and found them useless when thirst set in. The river marked with confidence on their charts wasn't where it was supposed to be, while the people they dismissed as illiterate could recall a dozen springs hidden in gullies. Universal maps gave the illusion of mastery, but survival depended on microgeographies, the details only lived experience could hold. Oral systems preserved this granularity better than ink ever could. Stories weren't meant to cover the whole world. They told you how to cross this plain, at this time, under this sky. Songs held directions tuned to specific places, impossible to mistake for anywhere else. Knowledge wasn't diluted for universality, it was sharpened for context. And this wasn't inefficiency, was resilience. While a universal map failed everyone when it failed once, localized systems could adapt place by place, group by group. Each community refined its knowledge to match its terrain, producing dozens of maps without paper, drawn in memory and ritual. Universality was the European dream. Particularity was the indigenous advantage. The tension was obvious. Colonists wanted clean borders that could stretch across thousands of miles, while those who lived in the land understood that no such border could ever reflect reality. A trail was safe in summer but deadly in spring. A hunting ground thrived one year and emptied the next. Fixing those truths into permanent lines was like trying to nail the wind to a board. And this insistence on borders wasn't just impractical, it was an illusion that carried its own dangers. Because once a map drew a line, it pretended to make something real that, on the ground, refused to exist at all. Maps don't just claim to show rivers and mountains, they invent borders, thin lines carved across parchment as if the land itself respected ink. But in vast territories, those borders were fantasies. The prairie didn't end where a line said it should. Deserts didn't pause politely at a dotted boundary. Forests and tundras spilled across cartographic claims, ignoring human declarations with the same indifference as migrating herds. For indigenous communities, borders were baffling abstractions. The land was understood as a continuum: seasonal ranges, overlapping hunting grounds, shared rivers, Access was negotiated through relationships, rituals, and timing, not through the fiction of a straight edge. A border drawn on paper meant nothing when the bison crossed it, when the salmon swam upstream regardless, or when winter forced people to move where food could be found. Ink made walls where the land refused to have any. Colonial powers, however, treated borders as reality. A line drawn in London or Paris supposedly fixed the destiny of territories thousands of miles away. The absurdity was visible on the ground. Two rival empires might claim the same valley, neither realizing that the valley itself flooded each spring and became useless for months at a time. Yet on maps, it looked like prime real estate, parceled neatly in rectangles and names. The illusion had consequences. Once a border existed on paper, armies marched to defend it, settlers crossed to claim it, treaties were signed to legitimize it. All of this activity centered on a fiction, while the actual land mutable, shifting, seasonally, alive remained, unmoved by the entire performance. A river shifted course, and suddenly empires quarreled, not because the land had changed, but because their lines no longer matched it. Indigenous systems had no need for such illusions. Territories were defined by use, not by geometric abstraction. A place belonged to those who knew it, who moved with it, who respected its cycles. Boundaries were porous, negotiable, and constantly redefined through interaction with the land itself. This flexibility made survival possible in environments that punished rigidity. The eerie irony is that European borders, meant to impose order, created more chaos. Wars fought over lines that didn't exist in reality. Settlements starved when maps misled. Treaties collapsed when ink ignored ecology. The land itself kept erasing the illusion, season after season. And yet, colonial persistence clung to maps as tools of power, convinced that drawing meant owning. This misinterpretation shaped centuries of conquest and misunderstanding, blinding outsiders to the systems of navigation and knowledge that actually worked. Because when they dismissed indigenous practices as primitive, they weren't just ignoring stories and songs. They were misreading entire systems of orientation that made maps unnecessary in the first place. When Europeans arrived with their paper grids and compass roses, they often mistook the absence of maps for the absence of knowledge. To them, cartography was synonymous with civilization, and anything else looked like ignorance. But this blindness wasn't just arrogance, it was catastrophic misunderstanding. Oral navigation systems, star-based orientation, seasonal memory, all of it was dismissed as folklore while they got themselves lost in territories locals had traversed for centuries. Colonial officials wrote reports that marveled at how communities wandered without roads, never realizing those movements were as precise as any compass. They described hunting ranges as unclaimed land because they couldn't see how timing, ritual, and shared understanding structured access. They mistook adaptation for aimlessness, interpreting mobility as disorder rather than strategy. The irony is delicious. Men with maps, starving while surrounded by people who could navigate to food sources without needing a single line drawn. Even when colonists tried to adopt local knowledge, they filtered it through their own frameworks, mangling it into partial truths. A constellation that anchored entire calendars was reduced to a decorative star chart. A story about seasonal animal migrations was treated as myth instead of ecological instruction. They translated knowledge into their language and lost its precision in the process, like copying a symphony onto a kazoo. This misinterpretation wasn't harmless. Maps became weapons. Once the land was flattened into squares and borders, it was easier to declare ownership, ignore existing systems of stewardship, and justify conquest. By misunderstanding navigation as primitive, colonists claimed superiority and imposed their fragile, inaccurate tools as universal. They didn't just fail to learn, they insisted their failures were the standard. Yet the land itself kept betraying them. Maps warped, borders collapsed, expeditions failed. The very arrogance that dismissed indigenous systems also guaranteed colonial blunders. But power wasn't measured in accuracy, was measured in ink and authority. And so the misinterpretation was written into treaties, law, and policy, while the systems that actually worked continued in practice, often hidden or dismissed. The eerie part is how long the misinterpretation lasted. Even today, people imagine maps as objective truth rather than cultural tools, forgetting that entire worlds of knowledge thrived without them. Colonists misread resilience as weakness, complexity as simplicity, fluidity as chaos. and in doing so, they erased what was in fact the most adaptive navigation strategy suited for vast and unstable territories. Because the final irony is this: maps were never about orientation in those lands. They were about power, control, and appearances. And while indigenous systems ensured survival, cartographic illusions ensured dominance, at least on paper. By the end, it becomes painfully clear that maps in vast territories weren't really tools for living. They were trophies, props, and signatures of power. A map pinned to a colonial office wall said nothing about how to cross a frozen river in April or where to find water in a drought, but it announced ownership, as if the lines themselves could tame land that laughed at permanence. Cartography promised control, not accuracy. It allowed distant rulers to claim landscapes they'd never seen, to divide resources they didn't understand, and to justify authority they couldn't enforce without constant correction. On the ground, survival still depended on cycles of stars, seasons, migrations, and memory. But on paper, survival was irrelevant. What mattered was the illusion of mastery. This disconnect is haunting. The people who knew how to live with the land reading its transformations, timing their movements with celestial cues, were dismissed. Meanwhile, those who could barely keep their maps intact in the rain wielded them as instruments of empire. Fragility became strength, not because it worked, but because it was backed by armies, treaties, and declarations. Maps didn't erase oral systems. They buried them under authority. Yet the knowledge persisted, carried in stories, rituals, and practiced long after the ink had faded. In truth, survival never belonged to maps at all. It belonged to the systems that treated the land as alive, unstable, and cyclical. That knowledge was inconvenient for power, but it was indispensable for life. And so the irony remains. The very objects elevated as emblems of civilization were often useless in the environments they claimed to master. While stars continued to rise on time, while rivers continued to swell and shrink, while herds continued to move, paper maps curled at the edges, bleeding ink into the margins. They were symbols, yes, but symbols of authority rather than orientation. In vast territories, survival didn't come from the mapmaker's pen. It came from memory, ritual, and a gaze turned skyward. The heavens offered more guidance than any paper ever could. A truth obvious to those who lived within the cycles, and invisible to those who insisted on borders. The land could not be flattened, and the map, however precise, remained only a shadow useful to those in power, but irrelevant to those who needed to survive the night.